Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
Hello. This week we're looking at guaranteed rent schemes, specifically the schemes where a landlord will sign an agreement with an agency, the agency sign an agreement with the council, and the council sign an agreement with a tenant. It's not an area of lettings that I thought I would have such strong feelings about, but it's a very interesting subject. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, so in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about guaranteed rent. Just to sort of preface this, what is guaranteed rent? In a nutshell, this is where a landlord hands over a property to a third-party company, a specialist, and receives the rent, whether the tenant's there or not, whether there's anyone occupying it. And this is for a fixed defined period, usually 2 to 5 years. One of the main compromises, the rent is a little bit lower than the private market rent, but they also benefit from not having vacant void periods. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, Rachel.
Absolutely. I think the key thing for landlords to remember with this type of scheme, the guaranteed rent scheme, is that your tenant is then a third-party company. And there are a few different types of guaranteed rent schemes. So there is the guaranteed rent scheme that's the type that Romesh works with, where they are a third-party company who deal exclusively with local authorities. There are professional guaranteed rent schemes that you may see on the high street who deal with professional tenants. And there are smaller rent-to-rent schemes that are being set up, which do fundamentally the same thing, but they can be dealing with councils, they can be dealing with private people. And then there are you can rent direct to the council. So those are sort of, I think, the four key rent-to-rent type schemes. Right, yeah, Romesh?
That's right.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay, all right. And most of these, as you say, last for 2 to 5 years. And the landlord is guaranteed rent regardless of whether there is tenant in place or not. And that rent is paid by the third-party company. Okay, so as I say, if you are a landlord, you have an agreement with the third-party company. That third-party company either then has an agreement with the council, or they have an agreement direct with the tenant. But if they have an agreement with the council then have an agreement with the tenant. So if you're going through one of these schemes, you could be 3 people removed from the actual tenant in your property. And that's for 2 to 5 years, roughly. So let's say, under what circumstances normally would you say that landlords come to you rather than going to a standard letting agent?
Under what circumstances? I think generally where they've had a bad experience on a private let, where they've experienced rent arrears, and then they've had to evict a tenant, or they've had a lot of damage done to their property, or they're going further afield and they don't really want to be too involved in their property on a day-to-day basis, and they want certain boxes ticked, so to speak.
So it's more of a hands-off thing for those landlords.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So, let's say I am going to live abroad for 5 years or so, 5 years minimum.
Yeah.
And I think, the easiest way for me to do this is to give my keys entirely to yourself.
Yeah.
I know I'm then not going to have any issues with my rent. I know I then don't have to worry about any damages. I can leave it all in your hands. What happens between me contacting you and saying, yes, I'd like you to do this, and a tenant actually moving into my property?
Essentially, usually what would happen is you'd have a meeting with the owner of that property, or you'd do an inspection from when they first contact you. and to establish the condition standard if the property meets the standards of the local authority. So local authorities have quite high standards in terms of health and safety features. So fire doors are required, mains-powered smoke alarms, heat detectors, mechanical extractors, window restrictors, fire blankets, extinguishers, etc. So there's various health and safety features that need to be put in place. So once that inspection's done, we'll establish what needs to be done, and then that work needs to be carried out before the property can be offered to the local authority. Once the property, those works are done, it will be offered to the local authority, and then they would normally nominate a suitable household within 1 to 3 weeks on average, I would say.
Okay, so this is one of the key points that when we talked about tenant selection last week and the importance from a private sector point of view of getting the correct tenant and doing referencing, thorough referencing.
Yeah.
With the scheme that you operate, or when it goes to the council, there is effectively no selection. It's just, are they the right size household for this property?
Correct. They need to be the right size so they don't overcrowd properties. However, they aren't able to give you credit, financial, employment, any of those sort of reference and checks that we talked about last week in tenant selection. It is one of the drawbacks of this scheme. The local authorities, this is how they operate the scheme, because they've got a duty to assist families. They want to be able to use properties and place them in properties. So, yeah, it is a downside for sure.
Yeah. So from a landlord perspective, where we were saying previously that we will reference whether they're available, they're able to pay the rent, that's kind of irrelevant from your point of view, because guaranteed rent is guaranteed rent. But from a damage and antisocial behaviour point of view, you're not getting that previous landlord's reference. So or any other kind of check. So basically, the person that ends up in that property could well be someone that a previous landlord had been quite happy and quite willing to move on without without any concerns, or possibly someone that's been evicted by another agent or landlord. They could potentially have issues that are ignored, basically.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're not privy to any of the background of a family, and that is nominated to us. Unfortunately, this is one of the the downsides we've never been able to overcome. Unfortunately, but
okay. So I have a property, let's say, and it's you rent. I give it to you. You rent it out, and the person that moves in is not very nice for a variety of reasons. So let's start with they're damaging the property.
Yeah.
Now, first off, would you tell me that they're damaging the property?
Depends really on the damage, if I'm honest with you. But more often than not, if there's internal damage to the property, we would put that right at our company expense. So we carry out bi-monthly property inspections, and we do this to all of our properties. We're obliged to with the local authorities. We're trying to see, are the families living there? Are they looking after it? Is there any damage being caused? What we do find is that there is a much higher level of damage not potentially caused by our these households. However, so it does cost us a lot of money to put these things right, but we don't bother the landlord, because that's one of the things that we've made clear at the outset. We would put right damage. So certain bits of damage, we think, right, we need to deal with this straight away. This is a health and safety issue. There's an electrical socket or wiring that they've changed the light fitting and they've not done it safely or correctly. We need to put that right, get that checked and deal with that. But other items where if they're not keeping the property as well, damaging, like sort of children are scribbling on walls, or there's damage to carpets or whatever, then those are things we wouldn't go and change. Like we talked about before, hair tongs. We're not going to go and change a carpet while a tenant's living there when they're burning it with their own hair tongs or whatever. That's something we would deal with at the end of that tenancy. But it is a big problem. We do incur heavy costs in terms of tenants causing damage. The important thing that we like to do is try and pick up this stuff early. So we're not having this property that's in an awful, terrible condition in a really, really big way, because we've inspected and we are able to try sometimes to talk to local authorities, get them out to inspect and warn tenants at an early stage if we identify those kind of problems.
Okay, so let's go back a step. Yeah. So you said bi-monthly. Do you mean every 2 months, or do you mean twice a month? I know there's always a confusion there. You mean...
No, once every 2 months.
Once every 2 months. So you'll go out and inspect.
Yeah.
And you say that you get more instances of damage. Is that more than you would get in a private rental sector, presumably.
Definitely much more than you would in the private sector, I would say, for sure.
Okay.
So every week and day when a tenant, our inspecting officers come back, there is a series of different items that need tackling. Some of them small stuff, and sometimes it's bigger stuff, which, it's accumulated over a period that needs tackling at this point. But yeah, it's quite a common occurrence.
Okay, so I know we try not to listen too much to people's just random opinions that are based on hearsay.
Yeah.
But quite often I will meet with people who've been through a guaranteed rent scheme. So landlords who've had their properties back from a guaranteed rent scheme, or who are sort of weighing up do I go private, do I go guaranteed rent? And there are a few things that you hear that are folklore or what have you, I don't know, but they're possibly a little bit exaggerated in terms of people's experiences. One of them does tend to be damage, in that, yes, I've had my property returned, but is it in the same condition as I gave it to the agency? No, it's not. It's been painted, yes, but not in any manner that you would say was done by a professional painter, or the repairs have been done and they've been done a bit piecemeal, which is often something you will also see in a private rental property. You'll see something that's been rented for years and years and years, and you look at it and you just think, this is a rental property because these repairs have been done without love and care. And that's kind of the feedback I get sometimes from people who've been through guaranteed rent, is that, yes, it's been painted. Yes, there's a carpet down. It's not the carpet I put down. It's nowhere near the quality of the carpet I put down. So if it's a landlord who's worried about damage, then presumably this is going to be an issue for them.
Yes, it is, and no. I think sometimes landlords have to be realistic in their expectation. They're not going to get a property back in the way it came. It's going to be returned in a similar condition, allowing for reasonable wear and tear. And I think sometimes landlords don't reflect the time period that their property's been let on a guaranteed rent scheme sometimes. So at the start, when we take a property on, we do an inventory, photographic and a written one, to have a record and a base position to protect ourselves against sometimes tenants making complaints, local authorities querying whether we've given it to them in an acceptable condition, and also landlords coming back to us and say, well, I gave it to you like this is how it was, etc. But 6, 7, 8, 9 years later, it's not going to be the same. It's going to look more tired. I take your point about repairs. Yes, sometimes I've heard stories and I've seen myself sort of poorly done repairs done in a property by guaranteed rent agents. I'd like to think that we don't do that, and we try to get repairs done to a good standard. Sometimes you have a situation where you've got a landlord who doesn't have the budget and doesn't want to really sort of deal with a repair when it's their responsibility. So there can be an implication that it's the guaranteed rent agent that's responsible and done a poor repair. But sometimes you'll get landlords who don't want to fully deal with something and want to just deal with something just to get them going, if you see what I mean.
So hang on, so which repairs is I thought you covered all damage. Which repairs is the landlord responsible for then?
Damage, yes. Wear and tear repairs, Rachel. Sort of a normal wear and tear item, that's something that a landlord would still remain responsible for. We certainly don't take responsibility for absolutely everything in a property.
Hang on, okay. So I give you a property.
Yeah.
It's in good condition. You put a tenant in, or the council put a tenant in.
Yeah.
There's then wear and tear on, say, the carpets.
Yeah.
At what point does that become my responsibility as a landlord to replace?
I mean, depending on
at what point do they do stuff that is not up to standard then? I'm just a little bit confused. Are they doing stuff mid-tenancy, or do they get the property back? The landlord?
Yeah,
so you said
so the landlord is expected. So the landlord is responsible for repairs and maintenance, okay, in the normal way, like you would with a private tenant. So there might be issues that arise during the course of that tenancy that would require a repair, and the landlord will send their own contractor in sometimes to deal with a repair or to replace an item or whatever if it's come to its end of its life. What we don't take a property on in a brand new condition. It's in a condition that's acceptable for the local authority's use. Yeah.
Okay. Now my understanding was, maybe I've got this wrong, but my understanding was they give the property to you and then it is yours. So okay. So you're saying if a boiler breaks down, that's down to the landlord.
100%. Yeah.
If a heater comes off the wall, let's say it's an electric heater, if a heater comes off the wall, is that wear and tear and down to the landlord, or is that down to you as damage?
Well, you've just got to make a sort of a sensible judgment call on something like that. So more often than not, that might be due to tenant damage. But imagine you've got a wall, an older property, and it's got a blown plaster because of age over time, and your brackets are coming away from the wall because of blown plaster, not because the tenant's misused it or done something. Then you may have a situation there where that's a wear and tear issue, which might need the radiator coming off and putting a piece of a board or ply across there to sort of spread the load and be able to get a firmer fixing, as opposed to replastering the whole house, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Okay. It's just interesting because in my head, I thought landlords would hand over to you completely. So in the same way that if we have maintenance issues, 99 times out of 100, even if it's the landlord's responsibility, we will arrange for the people to go round. I've not had any kind of positive experience of landlords arranging their own contractors to go round. I found sometimes the standard of work isn't as good. Sometimes they've tried to get people to do things when they're not insured or qualified or certified to do so.
Yeah.
Sometimes the landlords have tried to do things themselves with disastrous results. And sometimes it just takes a very long time to get things done that way, although use a variety of people. But basically the tenant experience has then not been good. So I have 2 landlords who I'm happy use their own contractors at the moment. But other than that, we it's not something we do anymore for those reasons.
So you insist that every landlord must use your contractors? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if insist is exactly the word, but where previously people would come along and they would say, okay, I'd like you to manage, but I want to use my own contractors. So, and they kind of swing it that if it's easier for us because we just have that one point of contact, which is them, and they then get their own contractors to go in. That I don't sign up for anymore because that is invariably more hassle for me, less quality work or lower quality work, and a worse experience for the tenant. But if every now and again the landlord says to me, oh, it's okay, I know a roofer, that's fine, I'll ask, can we ask my guy to go around and do it? And where I can work with that contractor, that's great. I mean, that I'm happy with. But someone who starts off with I always want to use my own people, I am your first point of contact if there's an issue, I don't entertain that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have landlords say, we have a few that have said, I will do all my own maintenance, and they do, and that's worked. So obviously where you haven't, over time, you've had to sort of go your own way, so to speak, if they're not carrying out work to the required standard. But I don't generally get landlords saying, I will do absolutely everything, and you're not to do a single thing for me, blah, blah, blah. They normally will work with you and communicate with you and deal with it appropriately, really, as and when the issues arise. So we kind of do a
okay,
mixture.
That's an interesting one. But I mean, we'll come back to that another time.
I don't think that's uncommon with guaranteed rent.
The landlords do their own works
or get involved and arrange their own contractors, not necessarily do it themselves, but they may have their own dedicated contractor they want to use if they have a portfolio or whatever.
Okay. All right. So going back to the damage side of things, let's say, so you can't select based on whether they've had a history of causing any damage before or anything like that. So you said, what would you do then to make sure that you said about you go around and you do visits and you have words with tenants, and presumably if this is someone that I've evicted previously, they've had those words from someone like me or from a private landlord previously.
Sure.
I don't know, maybe you do it better and therefore they listen to you. But you then went on and said that you would talk to the council. What is it the council would do that would be above and beyond what we would do that would have resulted in them being evicted before?
Well, with the nuisance antisocial behaviour, there is a sort of protocol that the councils have, which is that the agent must visit, warn, inspect and investigate that first, and then keep them included in that so they're up to date. So we always make a point of copying them in and notifying them of incidents that are occurring. So it's not just a case of, right, please evict this person, please move this person today because this has happened. There is a build-up. So we're building a case, and we try to do that as early as possible so that we don't encounter delays further on where councils say, oh, well, you've never told us about this. I didn't know. Can you check this? Can you check that? We will have given them a whole history, because at the end of the day, it creates a lot of headache, time and work for us. And those tenants that cause that damage and antisocial behaviour take up a lot of our time, as we would always say in any business, that it's those sort of clients or customers that cause the most time drain can be sometimes the ones which you want to deal with quickly and efficiently. Otherwise, you'll end up spending your life dealing with a small percentage of tenants or whatever, or landlords. So we then report to the council, and the council will then, we would expect them to come along and visit and warn that family and, if necessary, serve a notice, because it's them that has the agreement with the tenant to be able to evict them, and to has the T's and C's in terms of the breach of tenancy is actually with the local authority. So we want to involve them, and including they have to be on board, provided we've given them a good story and evidence to show what the pattern of behaviour has been. And also, sorry, one last thing. Those tenants may lose their right to housing assistance from the local authority if they're doing something to lose their accommodation. So the local authorities like to get this evidence because it helps them to deal with them on their housing application and case, so to speak.
Okay, you mentioned a lot of things there, and I'm going to try and remember each bit that I wanted to comment on. Okay, so when we talked the other day about the issues of eviction from a private point of view, and we were talking about Section 21 being an easier route to go down because you don't have to come up with that evidence. Yeah. So you would need to give your tenant 2 months' notice, and yes, it's quite a long process to then go through the courts and everything else to get your property back at the end of Section 21. It's something that landlords can do relatively quickly. They tend to not go down the court route of, I think it's grounds 14, Section 8, because it is discretionary, yeah. And because building the case for that discretionary argument is quite problematic. So you have to do all the things that you're saying about building that case to then pass on to the council. So it seems a little bit like there is the evidence and everything that you would gather to do that, and then you pass it to the council, and then they do their own investigation. And I'm wondering about the timescales involved in that. That's kind of my first point.
Yeah, I would say generally the councils aren't evicting families for nuisance and antisocial behaviour. What they end up doing is moving them on because the agent will be saying to them, look, we can't continue. There's caused disruption and nuisance to these neighbours. This can't continue. It needs to stop. You need to deal with this situation. The local authorities generally don't want to go to court and evict that tenant because it's legal court costs, I suspect, and time taken and effort. So what seems to be their solution, they will look for an alternative property to move them on. I can't say for sure what their action is in terms of how they warn them and how they deal with them, and whether they're on their last chance saloon, and whether they would lose their right to any further housing if they were to do anything else. That I can't be 100% certain on what they do, but they certainly do move them on. They don't sort of let them sit there for ages and evict them and taking a year or whatever, which you can do if you have to go to court and evict a tenant, especially on nuisance antisocial behaviour if you're trying to prove it on that ground.
Okay, so that's a year after you've advised them that there's an issue. I'm
saying they don't let it run for a year, because it could take a year to, if you go on nuisance antisocial behaviour with the way the courts are and the delays, that can take time. And if you get a tenant who's disputing issues, that will take potentially, that will be spin it out, wouldn't it?
Okay, so then ultimately one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to take away that person or that family's rent to housing. And I don't know under what circumstances they would do that to a family, because I think there's always that responsibility to house children. But either they take away their right to a property, or they basically just move them on to another guaranteed rent property. And they say, someone's been evicted from my property for being horrible. Yeah. They then move into your property and the council move them on because they're horrible again. So quite possibly they're going to be horrible again wherever they go to. But that landlord, that guaranteed rent company, again, isn't able to do any kind of referencing on them.
Correct. I mean, we've got to put this into context as well, Rachel, because if this was every single tenant all of the time, we wouldn't be in business, and all these guaranteed rent suppliers wouldn't be in business. This scheme wouldn't work. Full stop. Because you'd have immense amounts of damage being done by 100% of the tenants all of the time. We would have simply walked away from this business and done private lets or something else. So I just trying to temper what you're saying. I get what you're saying and you're making a valid point, but equally it's in context. It's not about 100% of the time. It is probably 5% of cases that you have this sort of situation. Not, yes, the
Yeah.
damage you get in a higher percentage, but in terms of antisocial nuisance behaviour like this, it's not as, dramatic as.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about this because when we talked about this earlier in the week, I think you were saying 5 to 10% of your tenancies have some form of antisocial behaviour. And that's not however many are moved on, but that's however many start. And there is some form of antisocial behaviour, and you either get them to moderate their behaviour or perhaps they get moved on.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it, and I thought, from a private point of view, or from my point of view, I thought 5 to 10% is actually quite high, which is as you would expect because we do obviously quite a lot of selection. But we still have, I did think, maybe we only have like 0.3, 0.4%. But, maybe it's sort of somewhere between 0.5 and 1%, I would say. But I was reading something from an agency online the other day. It's a referencing place. And I won't say them because I'm not entirely sure that the stat is right. But they were saying 1 in 3 private tenancies ended because of some form of antisocial behaviour. I thought 1 in 3 is massive, and that cannot be right. I think personally it's more like the 1% for a private. So I take entirely on board that it's not every tenancy from your point of view. I just think the chances of somebody slipping through are obviously much greater on your type of scheme. Absolutely. for that precise reason.
Absolutely. And if that is a concern of a landlord that they do not want to have, then this scheme isn't necessarily the scheme for them, because they need to be, what's the best way of putting it? They need to have a strong pair of shoulders, and bear in mind that, if problems occur, that they can occur, they may occur. But what they do need to consider is whoever they're working with, are they going to be diligent and robust in trying to actually be proactive and deal with it if there is that issue and problem?
Bear with me just a minute. So you said from a landlord's point of view, they need to have strong shoulders.
Because there is a high chance of this happening.
From a landlord's point of view, they don't care though, because you're responsible for it.
Well, yes and no. That they're still maybe in touch with the neighbours. They may get issues with a block managing agent writing to them about an issue that's occurring. So they will still be involved in it to a degree. They're not totally removed, are they? And they're still in the picture. They are the property owner at the end of the day.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with you, and I think that's probably my bigger concern is the neighbours of this. I understand completely from a landlord point of view. It's relatively hassle-free because you can do all of the maintenance and repairs for them. They will get, you can arrange all the wear and tear issues as well for them. So they can be overseas and just receiving their rent every month. But from a neighbour's point of view, they're having to deal with the increased from 1% to potentially 10% issues. And if that's with a company like yours, where I know you do as much as you can to get the properties back, then it's considerably higher, I guess, with other agencies.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a fair point to make. Yeah, could be.
Okay. And also, I wanted to very quickly, that was the other point I wanted to come back to earlier on, when we were saying about moving families on if they're causing problems. How easily does that happen, given what you were saying last week about eviction, and at the end of a landlord's contract, the difficulties they have getting their properties back because the councils don't have anywhere to move people to.
Yeah.
So how easily do they move people on? Because that would be my concern, I guess, as a neighbour, is if I'm reporting all of this antisocial behaviour to you, you're then looking into it, I continue to report to you, you monitor it, you then pass it on to the council. How quickly are the council going to be doing anything, given that they don't have properties?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. Let's say talk about pre-pandemic in normal times of operation. They'd never evict, as I say. In terms of moving, they would probably, from the point you request, anything between 1 to 3 months. So there is a level of discomfort for those neighbours and those people around after, it's been requested, look, can you move these people on because the situation's not got any better? Now I suspect it's a little bit longer, but we have had situations where sometimes landlords have got in touch with local authorities directly and started hassling the local authority officers directly. And that's had an amazing impact, because suddenly they're being bothered by a phone call from this external party, a neighbour or a landlord, maybe in some cases. We don't encourage that at all. And that their local authority have acted a bit quicker, because they're actually feeling the real heat of not just of the agent where we're writing and talking to them about it, but also the actual third party customer. But that's not, I'm not saying this is the way that something they should be getting involved or have to, but that has happened in some cases. But there isn't a defined timescale. I can't say they will definitely be moved within 1 month. If I did, I'd be putting myself up for a shooting, so to speak, because I just can't predict. It is a little bit of an unknown. It's just a risk.
But presumably, I'm just imagining if I was a council officer, and I'm getting reports of half a dozen cases of antisocial behaviour and agents who want tenants to move on.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. If a landlord then phones me up and starts shouting at me, I'm perhaps going to prioritise that. But equally, presumably, the councils will, number one, deal with a tenant where the agent is constantly phoning up, constantly saying, do something, do something, do something, do something, do something, as opposed to writing an email, leaving it a couple of months and then writing another email. So presumably, A, if you want that tenant to go, your agent has to be on it and phoning constantly to try and get things sorted. And B, if you have an agent that's doing that, then presumably the council are less likely to give you a problem tenant next time you have an empty property. Or am I making that up?
You've got a point. I'd like to think that's right. To be honest, sometimes it feels like we get more problem tenants because they know that we're robust and efficient at dealing with them, and we'll deal with that. So it's kind of, you can be a victim of your own success in a way. You end up getting tenants who are more challenging because they kind of know that you will try to keep them in order and manage that situation and visit and inspect and warn them. So that's not necessarily always the case. Sorry, what was the first point you made? If you just go back.
So if I was a council officer and I had an agent or a landlord phoning me up constantly and saying, hi, it's me, it's 12 o'clock. Hi, it's me, it's 1 o'clock. Hi, it's me. When are you moving this person? Presumably they're more likely to move that person than if I'm just getting a, Monday morning, hello, it's me again. Have you found somewhere for this tenant to move to?
I would say yes and no. A lot of these local authority council officers are not on the phone or contactable by phone. With the whole working from home situation we have, and with local authorities moving away from direct dialing and numbers, etc., it is harder to get hold of those council officers, if I'm really honest about it. So as much as sometimes we do try and we do chase and we do write an email, it's not easy to get hold of those people. And you sometimes have teams where you've got a team and there's like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 officers, and they use one email box and receive, and it's like, well, who's dealing with this? So it isn't great dealing with local authorities, and it's hard work for us. We struggle sometimes, is the honest answer. But what I have found is where I've had landlords who have been so frustrated, so irate, and even neighbours, they've gone down the road and found a council officer, and they've harassed them to the point that officer basically has wanted to move this on, because they just want to move this problem off their desk, and they're frustrated with it. That has happened in some situations.
Yeah, I think anyone who's ever spent time trying to contact the council for a few things knows that they are obviously very, very busy, but it is very painful trying to get through, and you need to set aside an hour to be sitting on hold and listening to music. But you and I have spoken before about my reservations, if you like, with dealing with the council or not being able to vet tenants who go in. So my example is always about 15 years ago, a friend of mine having a guaranteed rent through the council, direct through the council, living above her, a family, and her life was made an absolute misery. And I was helping out with the logging of incidents. I was helping with contacting the various people, 2 people at the council. I'm going to say it's not Enfield, by the way, but contacting the people at the council to say this is happening on this day, writing really long emails, accounting for everything, went on for months. And from a council perspective, they would, to be fair, they would say, okay, we are going out to visit this property. Okay, we have been out to visit. We haven't seen what you're looking for, but best will in the world, they have to give 24 hours notice to go and do X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And if you are just one person and everyone else in the area is perhaps a little bit concerned about standing up and saying, hey, yes, there's a problem, which is often the case.
Yes.
It takes, you can feel like you're batting your head off the nearest brick wall. And so in the end, my friend actually sold up. It was horrendous. Her life it was affecting her mental health. And she had to actually sell up to and move on. So that's why I'm a little hesitant when it comes to we have to rely on this process to move somebody out. But that is definitely the extreme.
Yeah,
that's not an everyday occurrence. That is the extreme. Where was I going to go with that? I'm not sure. Okay, let's move on to something else then. So, okay, I understand the process of moving people on. Now, let's say I am. You have one of my properties, and I've just come off my fixed term. My mortgage has doubled or more. The rent that you're paying me no longer comes anywhere near to covering it. Can I argue for a rent increase at this point? I'm 2 or 3 years into my tenancy.
The simple answer is no. You're fixed. You've signed up and fixed for X period. So you're tied in. If you let your property to us, then you're tied in the same way. If you give it to a local authority, you're tied in and fixed for that period. So you do need to think carefully about your strategy. If you sign something up on one hand for X period, and then you have a mortgage that's sort of going to be only for a shorter period, you're hedging your bets and gambling that everything stays the same, I assume, which I have had landlords who sort of, I guess, done that and unexpected has happened. But often I hear landlords say, well, I've got a fixed rate for 3 years. I want to sign it for 3 years, where they sort of try and tie the two together, which is a sensible way of operating, really. But the simple answer is no, you can't.
Okay, that is it in a nutshell. Okay, no, so you can't. Okay, but let's say, are there any other reasons? So I can't increase the rent, but financially I just can't afford this. Am I then able to get my property back? Can I just say I need to sell my property? Financially, I cannot do this. I'm struggling myself. I sell this house or this flat, or I sell the house that I live in now. Can I get that property back?
The honest answer is no. Depends who you're dealing with and their attitude. When you deal with the local authorities directly, they have a lease for X period and they kind of stick to it. I guess, and if it was us, we would want some information and evidence, and then we would look at it and see, and try to be fair and sympathetic at the end of the day. But we can't give a cast iron guarantee that we would or we could, because we've obviously committed that property to the local authority we're working with as well. So I would say, everybody's case is you have to deal with it on merit. So if we get a situation where a landlord passes away, then yes, obviously we show some flexibility to say, well, okay, look, this property doesn't have to continue. We understand, but obviously you need to give us some time to arrange for this family to be moved on, assuming you're not wanting to continue. The executors don't want to continue with that arrangement. So we try to be flexible and sympathetic, but equally, it's not in the spirit of the agreement to just say, well, the rents are a lot higher now. I want more rent, so I'm going to serve notice and move this family on, because that's a little bit like a no-fault eviction, where somebody's just being asked to move on because somebody wants to increase their rate or rent or whatever.
Yes, I'd say the only difference is that with a normal rental, normal private rent, you can increase the rent every year. You can't increase it by stupid amounts unless the tenant agrees, but you do get to increase it every year. So there is a slight difference in that respect.
Yeah, but you don't always get landlords who sometimes you get landlords who don't have that patience, where they've not increased it for X number of years, and then they get frustrated.
And we did that but that's a learning, we said, for everybody based on where we are now, is that they need to increase on a regular basis. But the point is there is that provision. Anyway, okay, just coming back very quickly to mortgages, which brings me on to insurance as well. So there are restrictions, or there can be restrictions in mortgage policies and insurance policies as regards to what sort of tenancy you can have. I think the majority, is my understanding, assume that if you're renting your property out, you're going to be renting out on a short hold tenancy, a standard AST. And I've certainly encountered a couple of people who've done the private rent to rent scheme who haven't realised that and have then had to make some pretty quick movements to remove the tenant from their property. Is that something you come across a lot at all? Do people realise they need to have special mortgage and insurance?
Not everybody realises, but we do make them aware and say, look, you do need to check the terms of your mortgage and your buildings insurance to ensure that you comply. Because, like you say, there are a number of lenders who don't allow letting to the local authority or a third party or a guaranteed rent. There are some that do, who are more in the buy-to-let specialist market, but not all of them do. And it is a problem because I've had situations in the past where landlords had to take a property back. We tried to let a property, I think in Highlands Village, and the landlord realised that they didn't have the correct type of buildings insurance in place, and also the block managing agent had a restriction they were placing and were not willing to accept anybody other than standard AST. And so it is definitely a problem and something that landlords have to be aware of and keep an eye on. You can, where you've got flats and houses where you arrange your own policy, then you can get policies bespoke that will actually give you the right kind of cover. And you can arrange that. You're in more control of that.
You said two things in that really surprised me. So number one, Highlands Village. My perception, if you like, of guaranteed rent is generally that it's where landlords have investment properties, and they have those investment properties for a high, because they want to get a high yield, if you like, on their property. So they tend to be in areas where the properties are cheaper.
Correct.
Because although the rents are cheaper, they're generally not that much cheaper than other areas. But also, and so the guaranteed rent money that they get is actually still good in terms of giving them a yield, and they then don't have to worry about the void periods and damages and everything else themselves.
Yeah.
So Highlands Village doesn't strike me as one of those more deprived type areas. That is traditionally, or those are traditionally the inverted L that you get in say, Enfield and other boroughs, but for Enfield, where it goes down the A10 and then across the North Circular.
Yeah.
So those tend to be the areas that you would find guaranteed rent schemes in, rather than Highlands Village, which strikes me as rather more expensive. So I would have thought that the rents that you're paying compared to the rents that they could be getting on the private market are quite a bit lower. But also, that's my theory, that people don't use their own family homes or their own, where they've lived as themselves, as a guaranteed rent property. It tends to be more the investment.
Yes.
So that was a shocker for me. That's just a statement. That was a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting that.
It's the exception. It's not the norm, certainly.
No.
And I was a little bit surprised that they were interested. And when we get inquiries from landlords in certain locations and areas where the rents are much stronger and higher, this was pre-pandemic, so the gap between private and guaranteed rent wasn't so dramatic. It wasn't so dramatic as it is now. But yeah.
And also blocks. I'm surprised by blocks because I'm not an expert on block insurance, but I know that there are a lot of flats, obviously, that are guaranteed rent.
Yeah.
But block insurance, the ones that I've seen, have always tended to have a bit of a restriction as regards to the type of tenancy and even the type of tenant that you can have in a property. So how do landlords get around that if they're in a block that the block insurance says you must have an AST directly with the tenant?
I mean, they simply shouldn't be letting on that type of scheme. I suspect that they do, and that does go on. But the raw facts are not all buildings insurance policies specify NAST, and they're not as tight to specify. So if it's not clearly specified, I guess then it's not crystal clear on their buildings insurance schedule or the certificate. But it is an issue because I've had in the past some blocks where I had one in I think it was in Edgware, a small block, and the managing agent was saying, well, you can't let to this type of tenant. So the landlords in this case actually argued and said, look, this is not really fair. We need to make sure that we put the right kind of insurance in, so you've got the right to rent to different tenants. In this particular case, it was about DSS more so than letting to a council, because they were saying somebody on low income, there's a perception that if they're on low income, there's going to be a higher incidence of issues or problems or floods or leaks or fires, I guess, as I think we've talked about previously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's my understanding of where they sit with the guaranteed rent as well. So yes, previously, and it's been stopped obviously now, you can't let to DSS, but that my understanding from insurers was based on people being more likely to put up with a dripping tap and not wanting to cause problems, and then that dripping tap becoming a flood and so resulting in insurance claim. And as I understand it from one broker, the guaranteed rent, you're more likely to get a claim from that type of tenancy, which is why they rule it out, and which is why blocks, I guess, don't go for the tenancy, don't go for the insurance where it does allow for, because then the premiums are going to be that much higher for all the rest of the leaseholders. So while it might benefit one particular leaseholder who's doing guaranteed rent, it would actually impact negatively financially on the other leaseholders. But it's definitely something I think that the landlord needs to be aware of, because even on day one, if they give a property to you and yes, the insurance is fine, they need to make sure that year 2, 3, 4, 5, that the block insurance hasn't changed, the insurers haven't changed, and there aren't new restrictions.
Yeah.
So we have a block where there's a restriction on if a property is empty. I can't remember how long it's for, but if a property is empty, the water needs to be turned off and the electricity needs to be turned off, unless it's for a burglar alarm, in which case it needs to just be, that needs to be isolated. But those sorts of things, if you've got a guaranteed rent scheme and it doesn't necessarily have to have anybody living in the property, there's more chance of that property being empty for a period of time, no matter how short on properties the council are. So is that something that I would come to you and say, okay, my property needs to be checked on every 7 days if you've got it empty, and that the water needs to be turned off? Is that something that you would build into that, your cover?
Yeah, we haven't had such a tight restriction where it's every 7 days or 14 days, but certainly beyond 28 days, we've come across where landlords have said, look, this is the terms of the block. There was one property we had in East London in Redbridge, and in that situation, we did need to go and visit that property when we knew it was empty, because the local authorities were a bit slow letting this property. So we were going to visit on a regular basis, but we routinely visit our empty properties once every 2 weeks to check that there's no water leaks or anything untoward, because it has happened years ago. We've gone to a property, it's been empty for 3 or 4 weeks, and you get there's like a water dripping through the ceiling from the flat above, which whilst you could go today and then you could go in 2 weeks' time, it could start leaking after you leave. So you could still have that period of water leakage, but you're more likely to catch it earlier if you're going regularly, I guess. So yeah, we will build that in where we're made aware and it's crystal clear that, you definitely have to go within a certain time frame. Thankfully, It's not every property that there's these very tight restrictions on, because it would be very, very tricky to manage.
Yeah, yes, it would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I know we've only touched on your type of guaranteed rent scheme. So the guaranteed rent scheme where landlord rents property or has an agreement with agent has agreement with council has agreement with tenant, and we're not going to do the others now. But if you were to summarize this from a landlord perspective, what are the things that you would say about guaranteed rent that are the top 3 things they need to remember?
I've probably got about 4. Sorry, Rachel.
Okay, go with
top
4.
I think you've got to remember, look, the guaranteed rent schemes are not for every type of property or landlord, because it just doesn't suit or fit. It's not a one size fits all. And you've got to look at your own sort of journey and how long you're looking to let a property for, if it's short term, and if you're planning to move back into it and you need it back by a certain date. So it's, you need to look at it closely if you're a landlord, to see if you're a long-term investor looking on a long-term basis indefinitely, then I would say, yeah, it's not a bad scheme. It's something worth considering. There is a big risk with we're unable to check and select tenants. So you've got to, what's the phrase? You've got to have broad shoulders and be aware that you could get dragged into and reported in terms of the block contacts you and says, look, you've got a tenant here, and then you'd have to deal with us. These are things that could happen over time. So you've got to be comfortable with that risk and that situation occurring. We can't promise and give this cast iron guarantee that you won't have a nuisance or antisocial behaviour. We never do and never have done. all we can promise to do is to try to be proactive and deal with it as best as we can, like you would if you had that situation in one of your properties, Rachel. And I would also say do some due diligence on the agent, both financially and in terms of their online feedback reputation, because you want to be sure that people are generally saying decent, good things about them and there's not too much negativity. Because if there's negative stuff about an agent, you've got to wonder, well, if there is a problem, are they going to be interested and are they going to deal with it? Are they going to be responsive and diligent about that? So those are the sort of main things I would say to be aware of with guaranteed rent.
I would probably conclude on a lot of those. I think it is something to enter into carefully. I think any form of rental you have to enter into carefully. So I am always very wary of people who just focus on fee. I say you need to be very, very diligent. Anyway, so my things I would say are, number one, make sure you're doing this for the long term. There's a council in Wales who are looking at 20-year lets to the council. Maybe not that long, but I think you need to be in it for the long term. This is not a short-term option for people. Number two, I think you need to remember that as a landlord, your responsibility doesn't end when you hand over those keys. And you do have some responsibility to the community that you live in and to the people who are going to be potentially affected if the tenant that moves in is one of the 5 to 10% that you wouldn't want to have as your personal neighbour. And number three, remember you cannot be completely hands off. You need to make sure that your mortgage, your insurance, those things don't change. And if you do have a property that you're doing on one of these schemes, then I think you should be getting in touch with, personally, I think you should be getting in touch with neighbours, with the block manager, with all those people and saying, if there's a problem, you can always come to me if you're not getting any success elsewhere. Do not be a landlord that just says, talk to my agent. Make yourself available to intervene if necessary. Those would be my tips.
Okay, no, that all sounds very sensible, good advice, Rachel.
Thank you very much. I think on that happy note, we have done guaranteed rent.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
See you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.